There are people who walk among us wearing the armor of invisibility, not because they want to hide, but because the world has decided they're not worth seeing. The man who swept the parking lot behind the grocery store on Maple Street every Tuesday and Friday morning was one of those people. His name was Martin Webb, though almost no one bothered to learn it. To the shoppers pulling into their spaces, to the teenagers skateboarding near the dumpsters, to the managers smoking cigarettes by the loading dock, he was just the old guy with the broom, the one who moved slowly, who never made eye contact, who wore the same faded jacket year after year. They assumed they knew his story. They assumed poverty had carved itself into his bones the way weather carves stone. They were wrong about almost everything. If you're watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, I want you to do something for me. Take a moment and comment below which city you're tuning in from. Are you in New York, Los Angeles, somewhere small in the heartland, or maybe watching from another country entirely? I want to know who's here, who's listening to this story, because it matters. It matters that we're connecting across distances to talk about something everyone experiences, but almost no one truly understands. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a mirror. And you might see yourself in it before we're done. Martin Webb was 73 years old when I first became aware of him, though I'd probably walked past him 100 times before that without registering his existence. That's how it works with people like Martin. They occupy the margins of our peripheral vision, present but not present, there but not there. He lived in a small house on the eastern edge of town, the kind of neighborhood where chain-link fences sag and front lawns grow wild because no one has the time or energy or money to maintain appearances. His house was painted a color that might once have been yellow, but had faded into something closer to exhaustion. The roof needed repair. The gutters hung at angles. There was a crack in the front window that someone had covered with duct tape on the inside, and through that tape you could see the shadow of curtains that never opened. Everyone knew Martin was poor. It was simply a fact, like the weather or the date. You could see it in the way he dressed, always the same rotation of 3 or 4 shirts, pants held up with a belt that had extra holes punched into it because he'd worn the original ones loose. His shoes were held together with glue in places where the sole had separated from the upper, and in winter he wore a knit cap that had unraveled slightly at the edges, threads hanging down like thoughts he'd forgotten to finish. He rode a bicycle everywhere, an ancient thing with rust eating through the handlebars, and a basket on the front that he used to carry whatever needed carrying. Sometimes groceries, sometimes empty bottles he'd collected from the park to return for the deposit. Sometimes nothing at all, just the basket itself, like a statement of perpetual readiness for need. The people in town had their theories about Martin. Some said he'd lost everything in a divorce decades ago. Others claimed he'd been a gambler who'd bet away whatever small fortune he might have had. A few thought he was just simple, someone who'd never learned how to function properly in the world, who'd slipped through the cracks because no one had been there to catch him. There were whispers about alcoholism, though no one had ever seen him drink. There were assumptions about mental illness, though he never exhibited any behavior that seemed particularly disturbed. He was just quiet. He kept to himself. He worked his small jobs, swept his parking lots, mowed a few lawns in summer, shoveled driveways in winter, and otherwise existed in a space so narrow that most people forgot he existed at all. But here's what they didn't see. Here's what no one bothered to look for, because why would they? Why would anyone look beneath the surface of someone they'd already categorized, already filed away in the cabinet marked insignificant, already decided wasn't worth their time? Martin Webb woke every morning at 5:15 exactly, not because he set an alarm, but because his body had learned the rhythm over so many years that it simply knew. He would sit on the edge of his bed for a moment in the darkness, and he would breathe, just breathe. Then he would stand, walk to the bathroom, wash his face with cold water and begin his day. He ate the same breakfast every morning, oatmeal cooked on the stove, no sugar, just a pinch of salt and a cup of black coffee. The oatmeal came from a bulk container he bought once every 3 months at the discount grocery store on the highway, the kind of store where everything is slightly dented or past its prime sell date, but still perfectly good. He'd calculated long ago that this breakfast cost him approximately 37 cents per day, and that this was both adequate nutrition and absolutely sustainable. After breakfast, he would spend 30 minutes reading. He had a small collection of books, perhaps 60 or 70 volumes, that he'd accumulated over decades. They sat on a wooden shelf he'd built himself, organized by a system that made sense only to him. Philosophy mostly, some history, a few novels that had struck him as important when he'd first read them in his 20s and 30s. He would read slowly, carefully, often rereading the same page several times if the ideas were dense or if his mind wandered. This was his education, self-directed, lifelong, unwitnessed. Then he would prepare for work. He had a small notebook that he kept in the kitchen, nothing fancy, just a spiral-bound pad from the dollar store. In this notebook, he tracked every job he had for the week, the time he needed to arrive, the payment he would receive, and any supplies he might need to bring. He was meticulous about this. He'd learned early in life that chaos was expensive, that disorganization cost money in ways both direct and indirect, and that the simplest defense against poverty was structure. So he structured everything. The parking lot job paid him $40 each time he swept it, twice a week, which meant $80 a week, $320 a month. Though in months, with 5 weeks, he'd make $400. The grocery store manager paid him in cash every Friday, 20s folded once, and handed over without ceremony. Martin would take the bills, thank the manager quietly, and place the money in his front pocket until he got home. He never spent it immediately. He never even thought about spending it immediately. The money had a purpose, and that purpose was not instant gratification. People watched him work sometimes, usually without realizing they were watching. He moved with a kind of deliberate slowness that could be mistaken for laziness or weakness, but was actually precision. He swept every corner of that parking lot, every cigarette butt, every scrap of paper, every crushed can. He worked in a pattern, always the same pattern, starting from the far corner near the highway and moving inward in concentric rectangles until he reached the area near the store entrance. It took him approximately 90 minutes to complete the job, and when he was finished, the parking lot was genuinely clean. Not just sort of clean. Actually clean. This mattered to him in a way he couldn't have articulated to anyone, even if anyone had asked, which they never did. And here's something else they didn't know. Every Friday, after receiving his $40, after riding his bicycle home, after hanging his jacket on the hook by the door and removing his shoes and washing his hands, Martin would go to a small wooden box that sat on a shelf in his bedroom closet. The box was unremarkable, made of pine, about the size of a shoebox, with a simple brass latch that had tarnished over the years. Inside this box were envelopes, 27 envelopes, each one labeled in Martin's careful handwriting. Groceries, utilities, property tax, medical, bicycle maintenance, clothing, emergency. The labels went on. Each envelope contained cash, bills sorted by denomination, the amounts recorded in a separate ledger that Martin kept in the same box. When Martin received his $40 from the parking lot job, he would divide it according to a budget he'd created decades ago and refined over time. $10 went into groceries, $8 went into utilities, $5 went into property tax. The remaining $17 were distributed among the other envelopes according to current needs and future projections. This process took him approximately 10 minutes, and he performed it with the focus of someone conducting a religious ritual, which in a sense it was. If you're still with me, if this story is speaking to something in you, do me a favor and hit that like button. I know, it seems like a small thing, but it helps more people find these stories, helps more people connect with these ideas about money and life and the things that actually matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We're building something here, a community of people who want to think more deeply about the invisible forces that shape our lives. The town didn't know about the envelopes. The town didn't know that Martin had never carried a credit card debt in his entire life, that he'd paid cash for his house in 1979 and had never taken out a loan against it, that his property taxes were paid in full every year by January 15th, that he had no consumer debt of any kind. They didn't know because they never asked and he never told. Why would he? What possible benefit could come from explaining his private financial architecture to people who'd already decided he was a failure? There was a woman who worked at the grocery store, a cashier named Diane, who'd been there for almost as long as Martin had been sweeping the parking lot. She was in her 50s, divorced, with 2 grown children who lived in other states, and called her maybe once a month. Diane noticed things. It was her nature. She noticed that the man in the produce section always bought the bananas that were starting to spot because they were discounted. She noticed that the young mother with 3 kids always looked exhausted and sometimes put items back before reaching the checkout because she was mentally calculating and realizing she didn't have enough. She noticed Martin. What Diane noticed about Martin was that he never seemed stressed. This was unusual for someone who appeared to be living on the economic margins. She'd seen plenty of people in financial distress come through her checkout line over the years, and they all carried it in their bodies. Tight shoulders, worried eyes, the way they'd watch the register screen as items were scanned, doing mental math, praying they'd calculated correctly. But Martin, on the rare occasions when he bought something inside the store rather than just sweeping the parking lot, seemed completely calm. He would place his items on the belt, 3 or 4 things at most, always exact quantities, nothing random or impulsive. He would wait patiently. He would pay in cash, exact change, counted out carefully. And he would leave with a small nod and a quiet thank you. One day, on a whim, or maybe just out of curiosity, Diane decided to actually talk to him. He'd just finished his sweeping and had come inside to buy a single apple and a can of soup. She scanned the items and said, "You do good work out there. The lot always looks nice after you've been here." Martin looked at her, and for just a moment there was something in his eyes that surprised her. Not gratitude exactly, though there was some of that. More like recognition. Like someone who'd been walking through fog for so long that they'd forgotten what it was like to be seen, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, someone had called their name. "Thank you," he said. His voice was soft but clear, not the mumble she might have expected. "I appreciate that." "Do you like the work?" Diane asked. She didn't know why she was pushing the conversation, but something made her want to. Martin considered this. "I like that it's honest," he said finally. "You do the work. The lot is clean, simple cause and effect, nothing complicated about it." Diane handed him his change, which he counted carefully before placing it in a small coin purse. "Most people wouldn't think of sweeping a parking lot as meaningful work," she said, and immediately regretted it, worried it might sound insulting. But Martin just smiled, a small smile that barely moved his lips. "Most people measure meaning by the wrong things," he said. Then he picked up his apple and his soup and left. Diane thought about that exchange for days afterward. Most people measure meaning by the wrong things. What did that mean? What was he measuring? What did he know that she didn't? The seasons changed. Summer turned to fall to winter. Martin kept his routines, up at 5:15, oatmeal and black coffee, 30 minutes of reading, work, home, the envelope system. Every day essentially the same, with tiny variations that only he could detect. To an outside observer, it might have looked like a life of crushing monotony, poverty grinding him down into sameness, but that wasn't how Martin experienced it at all. For Martin, each day was an exercise in intentionality. Every choice was deliberate. When he decided to repair his own bicycle instead of taking it to a shop, that wasn't just about saving money. It was about maintaining self-sufficiency, about not becoming dependent on systems that could fail or disappear. When he chose to read philosophy instead of watching television, that wasn't just about avoiding the cost of cable. It was about feeding a part of himself that he considered essential, that couldn't be sustained by passive consumption. When he divided his earnings into envelopes instead of keeping it all in one place, that wasn't just about organization. It was about acknowledging that money has different purposes, different meanings, different temporal relationships. The money for this month's electricity was not the same as the money for next year's property taxes, even though dollars are fungible, and economists would say there's no difference. But Martin knew there was a difference. He'd spent his entire adult life learning the difference. Here's something you might find interesting. Martin had worked at the same factory for 37 years, from age 22 until he was 59. It was a manufacturing plant that made industrial components, nothing glamorous, just reliable work with reliable pay. He'd started on the floor, operating machinery, and over time he'd worked his way into a position that combined some technical skill with some supervisory responsibility. Nothing executive, nothing high-level, but solid. Middle class, by any reasonable definition. The factory had offered a pension, which was becoming rare even then. They also offered a 401k with a company match, which Martin maximized every single year. Not because he understood the complex mathematics of compound interest when he was 22, but because an older worker had told him on his second day, whatever they offer to match, you take it. That's free money, and free money is the only kind you never turn down. Martin had taken that advice seriously. He lived on less than he earned from day one. This wasn't easy, especially in his 20s and early 30s when all his co-workers were buying new cars, taking vacations, upgrading to bigger houses. Martin rented a small apartment and rode his bicycle. He packed his lunch every day, 5 days a week, for 37 years. He calculated once that he'd saved approximately $43,000 over his career just by not eating lunch out. $43,000. More than a year's salary, just from sandwiches made at home. His co-workers had thought he was strange. Some had pitied him, some had mocked him, though usually behind his back. "Why's he live like that?" they'd say. "What's he saving for? He ever going to actually enjoy his money or just die with it in the bank?" They'd laugh, and then they'd go finance another boat or take another cruise or buy another big-screen TV, and Martin would just keep packing his lunch. The factory closed when Martin was 59. Globalization, they called it. Cheaper labor overseas, market forces, the usual explanations that sound logical and inevitable when delivered by executives in conference rooms, but feel like violence when you're the one being displaced. Martin received his pension, which was modest but guaranteed. He received his 401k, which had grown substantially over 37 years of consistent contributions and compound interest. And he received a severance package, which was more generous than it needed to be, possibly out of guilt. He was 59 years old, in decent health, with no debt, a paid-off house, and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life, if he was careful, which he was, always had been, always would be. But something happened that Martin hadn't anticipated. When the structure of work was removed from his life, when he no longer had to wake up at 5:15 for a shift that started at 6:30, when his days suddenly became empty of purpose and routine, he felt himself starting to drift. Not mentally, not in any clinical sense, but spiritually maybe. He'd spent 37 years with his identity, at least partially wrapped up in being a worker, in contributing, in being part of something larger than himself. And now that was gone. So he'd started looking for small jobs, not because he needed the money, though he never told anyone that, but because he needed the structure. He needed to be useful. The parking lot job was one of several he took on. He also mowed lawns for 3 elderly neighbors who couldn't manage it themselves anymore. He shoveled snow in winter for anyone who asked. He repaired fences, cleaned gutters, did odd jobs that required more patience than skill. People paid him small amounts, and he accepted the money, and he divided it into his envelopes, and the system continued. What no one knew was that behind the modest lifestyle, behind the rusty bicycle and the patched jacket, Martin Webb had accumulated wealth that would have surprised everyone who knew him. Not massive wealth. He wasn't secretly a millionaire in the traditional sense. But by the time he was 73, between his pension, his 401k, his social security, and his savings, Martin had a net worth of approximately $850,000. $850,000. The man everyone pitied, the man they assumed was barely scraping by, the man whose poverty seemed so obvious that no one even questioned it, had nearly $1 million. But here's the question that matters, the one I want you to think about as we go deeper into this story. Why did he still live like he was poor? That's what everyone would ask if they found out, right? Why not enjoy it? Why not travel, buy a nice car, move to a better house, eat at restaurants, do all the things that money is supposed to enable? Why sweep parking lots for $40 when you have hundreds of thousands in the bank? Stay with me, because the answer to that question is the entire point of everything you're watching right now. And if you're finding value in this story, if it's making you think differently about wealth and poverty and the choices we make, go ahead and leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if you know someone like Martin. Tell me if you are someone like Martin. I read every comment, and your thoughts add to this conversation in ways that matter. There was a young man named Derek who lived 2 streets over from Martin. Derek was 26, worked at an auto parts store, and was drowning in debt. Credit cards, student loans, a car payment for a truck he'd convinced himself he needed, an apartment that cost more than he could afford because he'd wanted to impress a girlfriend who'd left him 3 months after he signed the lease. Derek was making decent money, probably $38,000 a year, but it all disappeared before he could even see it. Automatic payments, minimum balances, late fees, overdraft charges. He lived in a state of permanent financial anxiety, checking his bank account multiple times a day, playing a mental game of which bill could be delayed 1 more week. Derek knew Martin only as the old guy who rode a bike and looked homeless. He'd never spoken to him, never even really looked at him. But one Saturday afternoon, Derek's truck broke down right in front of Martin's house. The engine just seized, smoke coming from under the hood, the whole dramatic scene. Derek got out, furious, kicked the tire, pulled out his phone to call a tow truck that he couldn't afford, and then realized his phone was at 2% battery and about to die. Martin was in his front yard, pulling weeds from the small garden he maintained. He'd seen the truck stop, heard the commotion, and now he watched Derek with mild curiosity. "You okay?" Martin called out. Derek looked over, frustrated and embarrassed. "Truck died. Everything's fine." The defensive response of someone who doesn't want to admit they need help. Martin stood up, brushed dirt from his knees, and walked over. "You need to call someone?" "I was trying, but my phone's dying," Derek said. "You can use my landline if you want," Martin offered. Derek almost said no. The idea of going into this old man's shabby house, of accepting help from someone who clearly had even less than he did, felt like an additional failure. But his phone died right then, screen going black, and he didn't have a choice. "Yeah, okay. Thanks," Derek said. Martin's house inside was not what Derek expected. It was clean, first of all. Not just sort of clean, but genuinely clean. Everything in its place. No clutter, no mess. It was sparse, sure. Minimal furniture. But what was there was well maintained. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a couch that looked old but not worn out, that bookshelf with its careful rows of books, a kitchen visible through a doorway, simple and organized. It didn't look like poverty exactly, it looked like intentionality. Martin pointed to the phone on the wall, an actual landline, and Derek made his call. The tow truck would be 90 minutes. Great, just great. He hung up and turned to find Martin had poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the table. "You might as well sit while you wait," Martin said, "unless you'd rather stand outside with your truck." Derek sat. He drank the water. He felt awkward and out of place, and to cover it he started talking. "I just spent $1,500 on that truck 2 months ago. New transmission. And now this. I don't even know what's wrong with it, but whatever it is, I guarantee I can't afford to fix it." Martin nodded slowly. "That's hard," he said simply. "You have any idea how much it costs to just exist?" Derek continued, the words spilling out. "I mean, I work full-time, I do everything right, and I'm still broke. I'm always broke. I make money and it just disappears. Rent, car, insurance, food, debt payments. There's nothing left, ever. And now this." Martin listened. He didn't offer advice. He didn't say anything about budgets or saving or any of the obvious things. He just listened. "Sorry," Derek said after a moment. "You don't need to hear all this." "It's okay," Martin said. "Money's hard. It's especially hard when you're young and everything costs too much and nobody teaches you anything useful about how to handle it." Derek looked at him, surprised. "Yeah, exactly. Were you like this when you were younger?" Martin smiled that small smile again. "I made different mistakes, but yeah, it was hard." "How'd you figure it out?" Derek asked. Then, worried that sounded presumptuous, he added, Not that I don't mean to." "It's okay," Martin said. "I'll tell you what helped me, if you want to hear it." Derek nodded. "I decided early on that I wasn't going to let other people define what I needed," Martin said. "That's the trap. Everybody's telling you what you should have, what you should want, what you should buy to be happy or successful or acceptable. And if you listen to all that, you'll never have enough. There's always something more expensive, something newer, something that's supposed to make everything better, but it doesn't. It just keeps you running." Derek was quiet, absorbing this. "So I decided to figure out what actually mattered to me, what I actually needed, and then I built my life around that instead," Martin continued. "And it turned out I needed a lot less than I thought I did. And the money I saved by not chasing all that other stuff, I put it aside, just kept putting it aside. Not for anything specific at first, just because having it felt better than spending it." "But don't you ever want to do anything with it?" Derek asked. What's the point of having money if you never use it?" Martin looked at him steadily. "Who says I'm not using it?" Before Derek could respond, the tow truck arrived. He thanked Martin, went back to deal with his broken vehicle, and spent the next several days unable to stop thinking about that question. Who says I'm not using it? What did that even mean? The old man clearly wasn't spending money on anything visible, but he'd said he was using it. How? For what? 3 weeks later, Derek knocked on Martin's door. He'd had his truck fixed, another expense he'd put on a credit card, and the anxiety about money had reached a breaking point. He'd been thinking about what Martin said, about not letting other people define what you need, and he wanted to understand more. Martin opened the door, recognized him, and invited him in without hesitation. "I've been thinking about what you said," Derek told him. "About figuring out what actually matters and not chasing all the other stuff. And I want to do that. I really do. But I don't even know where to start. I'm so far in the hole already, I can't imagine how to get out. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that way, like you're too far gone to fix it, like the debt or the problems are just too big to overcome, I want you to know you're not alone. That feeling is real, but it's also not the end of the story. Keep watching, because what Martin told Derek might change how you see your own situation. And please, If this is resonating with you, if you're getting something valuable from this, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to reach people, and you can help make that happen. Martin invited Derek to sit, and for the next hour, he walked him through something he'd never shared with anyone before. He showed Derek the envelope system. He explained how he divided every dollar according to purpose, how he'd been doing this for decades, how it had allowed him to survive the factory closing without panic, how it had given him freedom that looked like poverty, but was actually the opposite. "The first thing you have to do is know where your money goes," Martin said. "Not guess, not estimate. Actually know. You have to write it down, every dollar, every day for at least a month. Once you can see it, once it's not just this abstract anxiety, but actual numbers on paper, you can start making decisions." Derek started doing that. He came back a week later with a notebook full of numbers, and when Martin looked at it, he didn't judge or criticize. He just asked questions. "Do you need this subscription? What are you getting from it? Is this the only place you can buy that, or are there cheaper options? If you cut this expense, what would you miss?" They worked through it together over several weeks, and Derek began to see his financial life differently. It wasn't that Martin had some secret technique or magic formula. It was that he'd simply taken control. He'd stopped being passive. He'd stopped letting the current of culture and expectation and marketing and peer pressure push him around. He'd decided what he wanted his life to look like, and then he'd used money as a tool to build that life, rather than letting money be a master that controlled him. Derek started making changes, small ones at first. He cancelled subscriptions he never used. He started cooking instead of eating out. He sold some things he'd bought and never really wanted. He paid more than the minimum on his highest interest credit card. And something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a Hollywood transformation. But he felt different, less helpless, more in control. Word began to spread, very slowly, very quietly, that Martin Webb knew something about money. Derek mentioned it to a friend, who mentioned it to a co-worker, who mentioned it to a neighbor. People started showing up at Martin's door, hesitant and embarrassed, asking if they could talk to him about their finances. Martin never refused anyone. He would invite them in, give them water, listen to their situations, and offer guidance based on what had worked for him. He never framed himself as an expert. He never claimed to have all the answers. He just shared what he knew, what he'd learned through decades of intentional living, and people found it helpful. A single mother trying to raise 2 kids on a waitress salary came to him drowning in payday loan debt, and Martin helped her create a plan to dig out. A retired couple who'd mismanaged their savings and were terrified of running out of money came to him, and Martin showed them how to restructure their expenses to stretch what they had. A young college graduate paralyzed by student loans came to him, and Martin helped him see that the debt was manageable if approached systematically rather than emotionally. He never charged money for this. That felt wrong to him. If someone tried to pay him, he'd refuse. "You can help someone else when you're on the other side of this," he'd say. "That's payment enough." But here's what still nobody knew. While Martin was helping all these people manage their money, while he was living in his small house and riding his rusty bicycle and wearing his patched jacket, his own wealth continued to grow. Not through any clever investing, not through any risky schemes, just through the simple mathematics of living below his means and letting compound interest do its work over time. His 401k, which he'd rolled over into an IRA when the factory closed, had continued to grow through market expansion. His pension and Social Security covered his modest expenses. The small amounts he earned from his odd jobs went entirely into savings, because he didn't need them for living. By the time he was 75, 2 years after Derek first knocked on his door, Martin's net worth had crossed $1 million. $1 million. The man teaching debt-ridden people how to survive on minimal income, the man who appeared to be struggling himself, had quietly become a millionaire. But he told no one, and his life didn't change. Same house, same bicycle, same routines, same envelopes in the wooden box, same 37-cent breakfast. Why? The answer to that question requires understanding something most people never grasp about money. It's not just a tool for buying things. It's also a tool for buying freedom, for buying security, for buying the ability to live according to your own values instead of someone else's demands. Martin's wealth wasn't sitting idle. It wasn't being hoarded out of fear or greed. It was actively being used, just not in visible ways. The freedom it bought him was the freedom to say no. No to jobs he didn't want to do. No to relationships that would complicate his simple life. No to social pressure to perform success. No to the anxiety that keeps most people trapped in cycles they hate. That freedom was worth more to him than any car or vacation or big house could ever be. The security it bought him was the security of knowing that if his health failed, if unexpected catastrophe struck, if the economy collapsed and his pension disappeared, he would be okay. He wouldn't be dependent on family members who might resent the burden. He wouldn't be at the mercy of systems that didn't care about him. He would have options. Options are what money really buys, more than anything else, and the ability it bought him to live according to his own values was perhaps the most precious thing of all. Martin valued simplicity. He valued work that was honest and direct. He valued learning, reading, thinking, helping others. He valued not being a burden. He valued self-sufficiency. And every choice he made with his money reinforced those values. The wealth wasn't separate from the values. It was the physical manifestation of the values, the proof that they worked, that they created something solid and lasting. Most people never understand this. They think wealth and frugality are opposites, that if you have money, you should spend it. That visible consumption is the point of earning. They look at someone like Martin and see poverty. They can't conceive that someone with resources would choose to live simply. It doesn't fit their mental model, so they pity him or dismiss him or think he's strange. And Martin lets them, because their opinions don't matter to him. He's not living for their approval. There was a moment, though, when Martin's secret almost came out. It was a Tuesday in March. Cold and grey, with that particular kind of late winter dreariness that makes you wonder if spring will ever arrive. Martin was at the bank, making his quarterly deposit from his pension and social security checks into his savings account. He preferred to do this in person rather than through direct deposit, because he liked the ritual of it, the physical act of handing over a check and watching the numbers change. It kept money real to him. Not just abstractions on a screen. The teller, who usually helped him, was out sick, so he was directed to a younger woman he didn't recognize. She processed his deposit efficiently, then glanced at his account balance on her screen and did a visible double-take. She looked at Martin, then back at the screen, then at Martin again, confusion evident in her expression. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'm seeing a balance here that seems... Is this correct?" Martin's face remained neutral. "Yes, but She caught herself, aware that she was probably violating some protocol by commenting on a customer's account. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. I was just surprised." Martin nodded. "It's okay. Can I get a receipt for the deposit, please?" She printed it, handed it over, and as Martin turned to leave, he heard her whisper to a co-worker, "That guy in the old jacket? He has over $1 million in his account." The co-worker glanced at Martin's departing back and snorted softly. "No way. You're reading it wrong." "I'm not," the teller insisted. "I saw it clear as day, over $1 million. Then he's laundering money or something. There's no way that guy legitimately has that kind of money." Martin heard this exchange. He kept walking. He got on his bicycle and rode home. And he thought about how impossible it is for people to see past their assumptions, how the visible markers of wealth and poverty blind them to actual reality, how the performance of financial status has become more important than the substance of it. That night, sitting at his small table with a cup of tea, Martin made a decision. He'd been thinking about it for a while, but the incident at the bank crystallized it. He was 75 years old. He had more money than he would ever need. And there were people in his community who were struggling, really struggling, in ways that his wealth could meaningfully address. It was time to start giving it away, but he wanted to do it carefully. He didn't want the attention that would come from suddenly being known as the wealthy benefactor. He didn't want people to treat him differently, to look at him with the strange mix of deference and resentment that often accompanies known wealth. He didn't want his relationships with the people he'd been helping to change, to become transactional or manipulative, so he needed to be strategic about it. Are you still with me? Because this is where the story shifts in a way you might not expect. If you're finding this compelling, if you're thinking about your own relationship with money in new ways, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment below, and if you haven't liked the video yet, please do. It really does help others discover this story, and I think it's worth discovering. Martin started small. He heard through Derek, who'd become something of a regular visitor and friend, about a young woman named Sarah, who was working 2 jobs to support her disabled mother, while also trying to finish her nursing degree. She was exhausted all the time, barely sleeping, falling behind in her classes because she didn't have enough hours in the day. Martin asked Derek for her address, rode his bicycle to her house, and knocked on the door. Sarah answered, wary. She didn't know this old man standing on her porch. Martin introduced himself, explained that Derek had mentioned her situation, and said he wanted to help. He held out an envelope. "What's this?" Sarah asked, not taking it. "It's money," Martin said plainly. "Enough to cover your tuition for the rest of the year and replace the income from one of your jobs for 6 months. You can quit one job, focus on your studies, spend more time with your mother. No strings, no repayment needed." Sarah stared at him. "I don't understand. Why would you do that?" "Because I can," Martin said, "and because you need it. And because if you're able to finish your degree and become a nurse, you'll help a lot of people over your career. This is an investment in all those future people you'll care for." "But I don't know you," Sarah said. "This doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to make sense," Martin replied gently. "You can accept it or not. But if you don't, I'll just find someone else who needs it. I'd prefer it was you." Sarah took the envelope. Inside was $12,000 in cash. She burst into tears right there on her porch, and Martin stood awkwardly, not sure what to do. He patted her shoulder once, nodded, and left. He did this again and again over the following months, always anonymously or nearly so, always through intermediaries or careful research. A family about to be evicted received an envelope with 3 months' rent. A veteran struggling with medical bills after a VA denial found his debt mysteriously paid off. A community center that was going to close due to lack of funding received an anonymous donation that kept it open for another year. Martin moved through his community like a quiet ghost, redistributing his wealth in ways that made material differences in people's lives. He gave away nearly $200,000 that year, and his net worth barely dipped because the returns on his remaining investments exceeded what he was giving away. It was almost comical in a way. He was trying to reduce his wealth, to put it where it could be useful, and the wealth kept regenerating faster than he could distribute it. But he was having an impact. Lives were changing. People were getting opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. And Martin felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced from his own quiet accumulation. The money had always been abstract to him, numbers in an account. Now it was becoming real, tangible, in the form of relieved faces and grateful tears and futures that suddenly looked different. Diane, the grocery store cashier, noticed something. She couldn't have said exactly what it was, but there was a change in the community's energy. Small businesses that had been struggling seemed to stabilize. People who'd been stressed and anxious seemed a little lighter. There were stories circulating about mysterious benefactors, anonymous gifts, unexpected windfalls. She wondered if they were all connected. She wondered if there was someone in their small town who was secretly wealthy and giving it away. One day, during a slow afternoon, she mentioned this theory to a co-worker. "I think we have a millionaire living here. Someone nobody knows about," she said. Her co-worker laughed. "In this town, who? The dentist, the car dealership owner. Those are the only people around here with real money, and everyone knows them." "No," Diane said. "Someone we don't suspect. Someone living quietly." "That's crazy," the co-worker said. "Rich people don't live quietly. They want you to know they're rich. That's the whole point of being rich." Diane didn't argue, but she didn't stop thinking about it either. She started paying more attention to people, trying to see beneath surfaces. And one day, she was watching Martin sweep the parking lot through the store window, and something clicked. The way he moved. The deliberateness. The care. The absolute lack of hurry or anxiety. The sense that he was doing exactly what he wanted to be doing, exactly how he wanted to do it, with zero concern for what anyone thought. That wasn't poverty. That was freedom. She watched him more carefully after that. She noticed that he never seemed worried about money when he bought his simple groceries. She noticed that his choices were intentional, not desperate. She noticed the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity that didn't match the assumption of poverty, and she started to wonder. One Friday, after he'd received his payment from the parking lot job and had come inside to buy his usual apple and can of soup, Diane decided to take a risk. As she handed him his change, she said quietly, "I think I know what you're doing." Martin looked at her, his expression giving nothing away. "What do you mean?" "The gifts. The anonymous help. People are talking about it, and I think it's you." Martin was silent for a long moment. Then he said equally quietly, "Why would you think that?" "Because you're the only person in this town who understands what money is actually for," Diane said. Martin smiled, the small smile that barely moved his lips. "You should be careful about assumptions," he said. But there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of acknowledgement, that told her she was right. "Your secret's safe with me," Diane said. "I just wanted you to know that I see you. That's all." Martin nodded once, picked up his apple and his soup, and left. But something had shifted. Someone knew. Not the whole truth, but enough. Winter arrived, then faded into spring. Martin turned 76. His routines continued unchanged, but the giving accelerated. He'd found that there was a particular joy in anonymity, in helping without recognition, in making things better without anyone knowing who was responsible. It was pure, untainted by ego or expectation of gratitude. He just saw needs and met them, simple as that. Derek, who'd become his friend and occasionally his assistant in identifying people who needed help, asked him once, "Why don't you just set up a foundation or something official? You could probably do more that way." Martin shook his head. "Then it becomes bureaucratic. There are rules and applications and tax forms and all kinds of structure that gets in the way. This way is direct. I see someone who needs help, I help them. No intermediaries, no administrative costs eating up half the money. Just simple cause and effect." "But don't you want credit for it?" Derek pressed. "Don't you want people to know what you've done?" "No," Martin said simply. "Credit would complicate it. People would start treating me like I'm special, like I'm doing something extraordinary. But I'm not. I'm just using what I have to help where I can. Anyone with means could do this. Most just choose not to. I don't want praise for making the obvious choice." Derek thought about that. But you could inspire other people to do the same if they knew about it. Martin considered this. Maybe. Or maybe they'd just feel bad about themselves for not doing it, and they'd resent me, and nothing would change except everyone would be uncomfortable. I'd rather just do the work quietly and let the results speak for themselves. Have you ever thought about this? About whether doing good requires acknowledgement, or whether the acknowledgement actually corrupts the good? It's worth considering. And if you're still here, still engaged with this story, I'm grateful. Please take a second to like this video and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing it. These conversations matter more than we realize. There was a community meeting one evening in late spring, held at the local church hall, to discuss the town's struggling elementary school. The building needed repairs. The budget had been cut by the state. Programs were being eliminated. Teachers were buying supplies out of their own pockets. Parents were frustrated and scared about what was happening to their kids' education. The meeting was tense, full of passionate speeches and angry accusations, and the kind of helpless despair that comes from caring deeply about something while having no power to fix it. Martin attended, sitting in the back row, mostly listening. Various solutions were proposed: a fundraiser, a petition to the state, volunteer labor for the repairs. But everyone knew these were band-aids on a wound that needed surgery. The school needed about $70,000 to properly address its problems. That might as well have been $7 million for this community. After the meeting, Martin approached the school principal, a tired-looking woman named Helen, who'd been teaching for 30 years and looked ready to retire out of sheer exhaustion. If someone were to anonymously donate a significant amount to the school, how would you recommend they do that? Martin asked. Helen looked at him confused. I'm sorry, what? Hypothetically, Martin said, if someone wanted to give the school a large donation without anyone knowing who it came from, how would they arrange that? Helen blinked, processing this strange question from this strange old man she barely knew. I suppose they could work through the school district's foundation. Donations can be made anonymously. But why are you asking me this? Just curious, Martin said. Thank you. And he left. 2 weeks later, the school received an anonymous donation of $75,000. The principal cried when she got the news. The teachers cried. Parents cried. The local newspaper ran a story about the mysterious benefactor, speculating wildly about who it could be. Some thought it was a wealthy former resident who'd moved away and made it big. Others thought it was a local business owner who didn't want publicity. No one thought it was the old man who swept the grocery store parking lot and rode a rusty bicycle. Martin read the newspaper article while eating his 37-cent breakfast and felt a quiet contentment. The school would be okay. The kids would have what they needed. That was all that mattered. But something was changing in Martin. The giving had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose that was different from the satisfaction he'd gotten from his years of careful saving and investing. That had been about proving to himself that he could survive, that he could be self-sufficient, that he could resist the pressures that pushed most people into financial instability. It had been defensive, in a way, building a fortress. But this, the giving, was offensive in the military sense. It was active engagement with the world. It was using his fortress not just to protect himself, but to launch expeditions that helped others. And he found that he liked it. He liked being useful in this way. He liked the feeling of his money doing work in the world rather than just sitting and compounding. He started to think bigger. What if he didn't wait until he died to give away the bulk of his wealth? What if he spent his remaining years actively redistributing it, seeing the effects, guiding it to where it could do the most good? He could still keep enough to live on, enough to maintain his independence, but the rest Why not use it now when he could actually witness the impact? This was a radical thought for someone who'd spent 50-plus years accumulating and protecting. It felt dangerous, like dismantling the fortress he'd built stone by careful stone, but it also felt right, and Martin had learned long ago to trust that feeling, to trust his own judgment about what mattered. He was 76 years old. He was healthy, but realistically he probably had 10 years left, maybe 15 if he was lucky. What was he going to do with $1 million in his last decade of life? Die with it and leave it to who? He had no children, no close relatives. He could leave it to charity, which was fine, but impersonal, or he could use it now directly to make specific differences in specific lives in the community where he'd lived his entire adult life. The choice seemed obvious once he framed it that way. Over the next year, Martin gave away nearly $500,000. He paid off medical debts for 3 families facing bankruptcy from health crises. He funded scholarships for 5 kids who wanted to go to college but had no money. He covered the repairs for the community center and funded its programs for another 3 years. He paid for a young single father to go back to school to become a plumber, giving him a skilled trade that would support his family. He helped an elderly couple stay in their home by paying their property taxes for 5 years in advance. He funded a small business startup for a woman who'd lost her job and had a good idea but no capital. Each gift was anonymous, or nearly so. Each was carefully chosen to maximize impact. Each changed someone's trajectory in a fundamental way. And Martin watched it all unfold with the same quiet satisfaction he'd once gotten from seeing his account balances grow. But this satisfaction was deeper, warmer, more human. Numbers going up had been abstract. People's lives improving was real. The town began to notice the pattern. Too many mysterious gifts, too many anonymous donations, too many inexplicable strokes of fortune. People started talking more seriously about the possibility that someone among them was wealthy and giving it away. They started looking at each other differently, wondering, was it you? Is it me? Who's the hidden millionaire? Some people got greedy. Convinced that there was money being handed out, they started angling for some of it. They'd show up at community meetings with sob stories, some true and some exaggerated, hoping to attract the attention of the mysterious benefactor. This troubled Martin. He hadn't meant to create a culture of dependency or expectation. He'd meant to help people who were genuinely struggling, not to become a wishing well where anyone could throw in a request. So he became more discreet. He stopped responding to public displays of need and instead relied on his network of quiet observers, people like Derek and Diane, who knew the community and could identify authentic struggles versus performances. This worked better. The gifts continued, but the circus around them died down. One evening, Martin was sitting on his front porch, watching the sunset, when a car pulled up. An expensive car, BMW or Mercedes. Martin couldn't tell the difference and didn't care. A man in his 40s got out, well-dressed, confident, and walked up to the porch. "Martin Webb?" the man asked. "Yes," Martin said. "I'm Richard Donovan. I'm an attorney." He handed Martin a business card. "I represent several individuals in town who've received anonymous financial gifts over the past year. They've asked me to try to identify the donor because they'd like to properly thank them, and frankly, some are worried about tax implications of unreported gifts." Martin looked at the card but didn't take it. "Why are you here?" "Because several people have mentioned your name. Not as the donor necessarily, but as someone who seems to know things about money, who's been helpful to people, who might have information." "I don't have information that would help you," Martin said. "Mr. Webb, let me be direct. I've done some research. You worked at Hanson Manufacturing for 37 years. You received a pension and a 401k. Based on publicly available information and some reasonable assumptions, you have significant assets. Probably more than anyone in this town suspects." Martin's face remained neutral. That's my business. Of course it is, Richard said quickly. I'm not here to invade your privacy. I'm here because if you are the person who's been helping people, there are legal ways to do that, which would be more advantageous for everyone involved. Tax-deductible donations through a proper foundation, for instance. You could help more people with the same amount of money if you did it right. I'm doing it right, Martin said quietly, my way. But, Mr. Donovan, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not interested in advantageous structures or tax deductions or any of that. I'm interested in helping people directly, simply, without complication. And I'm interested in maintaining my privacy. So unless you have some legal reason to be here, I'd appreciate if you left. Richard studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but if you ever want to talk about more efficient methods, my card is here. He set it on the porch railing and left. Martin watched him drive away, then picked up the business card and tore it in half. Efficient. Everything was always about efficiency, about optimizing, about doing more with less. But sometimes the inefficiency was the point. Sometimes the directness, the human scale, the lack of intermediary structure was what made it meaningful. A check from a foundation felt different than an envelope of cash from a neighbor. Both had the same practical effect, but the emotional resonance was entirely different. And Martin was learning that emotional resonance mattered more than he'd previously understood. His years of solitary saving had been emotionally neutral. Money going into accounts, numbers increasing, a sense of security growing. But this, the giving, carried emotional weight. The gratitude of recipients, the relief in their eyes, the way their shoulders relaxed when a burden was lifted, that was real in a way that compound interest had never been. He thought about this for days afterward. About what money meant, about what it was for, about whether his lifetime of careful accumulation had been selfish or wise, necessary or neurotic. He didn't reach any definitive conclusions. It had been all of those things, probably. Selfish in some ways, wise in others. Necessary for his own security and peace of mind, neurotic in its extremity. But it had brought him here, to this moment where he had the ability to materially improve people's lives, so maybe the neurotic accumulation had been a means to a worthwhile end. Think about your own relationship with money for a second. Are you saving it for some abstract future? Or are you using it in ways that feel meaningful now? Are you trapped by it or liberated by it? These aren't easy questions, and I'm not suggesting there are simple answers. But they're worth asking. And if this story is prompting those questions for you, leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me how you're navigating these same tensions. This is a conversation we need to be having more openly. Derek came by one Saturday with news. His younger sister, who lived in another state, was in crisis. Her husband had left her with 2 young kids and enormous debt. She was about to lose her house. Derek was frantic, trying to figure out how to help her, but having almost nothing himself. He'd managed to get out of his own debt thanks to Martin's guidance, but he had no reserves, no safety net. He felt helpless watching his sister spiral. Martin listened to all of this, asked a few questions about the specific amounts and timeline, and then said, "How much does she need to keep the house and get stable?" "I don't know, maybe 20,000. But I don't have that. I don't have anything close to that." "I do," Martin said. Derek looked at him, confused. "What?" "I'll help her. Give me her information." "Martin, I can't let you. That's too much. You don't even know her." "You know her, and she needs help, and I can provide it. It's not complicated." "But why would you do that?" Martin smiled. "Derek, you've been coming here for 2 years. I've watched you change your entire financial life. You've worked harder at it than most people ever do, and now you're trying to help your sister, even though you don't have the resources. That means something. Let me do this." Derek's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand you. You live like you have nothing, But you're offering to give away $20,000 like it's nothing." "It is nothing," Martin said. "I mean, it's not nothing, but it's less than nothing compared to what I have. And it's everything compared to what your sister needs right now. So yes, it's nothing and everything at the same time. That's how money works." Martin sent the money to Derek's sister through a wire transfer, anonymously routed through Derek's account, so she wouldn't know where it came from. She called Derek crying, sure that he'd somehow bankrupted himself to save her, and Derek had to convince her that it was from a friend, someone with means who wanted to help. She never learned the truth about who her benefactor was, but Derek learned something in that exchange. He learned that Martin wasn't just frugal, wasn't just careful with money. He was wealthy, actually wealthy, and he'd been hiding it behind a performance of poverty so convincing that everyone believed it. "How much do you have?" Derek asked one day. Unable to contain his curiosity any longer, Martin hesitated, then decided honesty was appropriate. "A little over 600,000 now. I've given away about 400,000 in the past year and a half." Derek's jaw dropped. "You've given away $400,000? "Yes." "And you still have 600,000 left?" "Yes." "But you live like I have enough," Martin finished. "Which I do. I have more than enough. That's the point. Once you have enough, everything else is surplus, and surplus should be circulated, not hoarded. But you earned that money. You worked for it for decades. It's yours." "It is mine," Martin agreed, "which means I get to decide what to do with it. And I've decided to give most of it away while I'm still alive to see where it goes and to make sure it helps." Derek sat with this for a long time. Finally, he said, "I think you might be the wisest person I've ever met." Martin laughed, a rare sound. "I'm not wise. I just figured out what matters to me, and then I built my life around that. Most people never do that. They let other people tell them what should matter. That's the difference." Nadir. The revelation of Martin's wealth stayed between them, a secret Derek guarded carefully. But it changed how he saw everything. Every time he saw Martin riding his bicycle, he now knew it was a choice, not a necessity. Every time he saw Martin's patched jacket, he knew it was worn not because Martin couldn't afford a new one, but because the old one still functioned, and replacing it would be wasteful. Every time he saw Martin's simple house, he knew it was simple by design, not by circumstance. And this reframing changed Derek's own approach to life. He'd been working toward financial stability, toward the point where he could relax and enjoy himself, where he could buy the things he wanted without stress. But watching Martin, he began to realize that stability came not from having more income, but from needing less, from being content with enough, from finding satisfaction in simplicity rather than constantly chasing the next thing. The seasons turned again. Martin turned 77. His health remained good, his routines continued, his giving continued. He'd settled into a rhythm that felt right. He kept about $200,000 for himself, enough to cover his living expenses and any health crises for the rest of his likely lifespan, with a comfortable buffer. The rest he gave away over the course of 18 months. The impact was staggering, not in any dramatic, measurable way. There were no plaques or ceremonies or public acknowledgements, but lives changed, futures opened up, possibilities became real. A generation of kids in that town grew up with opportunities they wouldn't have had. Families stayed together who would have been torn apart by financial disaster. Small businesses survived that would have failed. The community became, almost imperceptibly, more stable, more hopeful, more resilient. And Martin watched all of it with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his lifetime of careful accumulation had culminated in something meaningful, that his wealth had been converted into human flourishing, that he'd gotten the equation right. But then something unexpected happened. Martin's bicycle finally gave out. The frame cracked beyond repair. He'd been riding it for 23 years, and it had simply reached the end of its useful life. He could have bought a new one easily. He still had $200,000. A new bicycle would cost a couple hundred at most. But Martin hesitated. The bicycle had been part of his identity for so long, part of the performance of simplicity that kept people from seeing his wealth. If he bought a new bike, even a modest one, would people notice? Would they start asking questions? Would the carefully maintained illusion crack along with the frame? He thought about this for several days, and then he realized he was being ridiculous. He was 77 years old. He'd given away nearly $1 million. He'd helped dozens of people directly and hundreds more indirectly. What did he care if people found out he had money? What was he protecting at this point? So he went to the bike shop, a small local place he'd never visited before, and he bought a new bicycle. Not an expensive one. He wasn't interested in fancy features or premium materials, just a solid, functional bike that would last. It cost him $240. The kid working at the shop, maybe 19 years old, helped him pick it out and then said, "You know, we have a program where we refurbish old bikes and donate them to people who need transportation. If your old bike is still mostly functional, we could take it and fix it up." Martin thought about his old bike sitting broken in his garage and said, "It's pretty far gone, cracked frame." "That's okay," the kid said. "We can salvage parts even if the frame is shot. Everything helps." So Martin brought his old bike to the shop, and they thanked him for the donation, and he rode home on his new bike, which felt strange and different and oddly luxurious, and he realized that this small purchase had been a kind of turning point. He was letting go of the performance, of the armor of invisibility, of the need to hide. Diane saw him on the new bike the next time he came to sweep the parking lot, and she smiled but didn't say anything. She knew what it meant. Martin saw her see, and he smiled back, and there was an understanding between them that needed no words. The lawyer, Richard Donovan, called Martin a few weeks later. "Mr. Webb, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to let you know that I've been helping several of the people who received anonymous gifts with their financial planning, and they all mentioned that you'd given them advice at various points. Not about the gifts, but about managing their money in general. And I've been impressed by the consistency and wisdom of that advice." "Thank you," Martin said, wondering where this was going. "I'm working with the community college to develop a financial literacy program for adults," Richard continued. "Free classes on budgeting, debt management, saving, basic investing, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to participate. Not as an instructor necessarily, but maybe as a guest speaker, to talk about your own experience with money. People trust you. They listen to you. You could really make a difference." Martin's first instinct was to refuse. Teaching a class meant visibility. It meant people would ask questions. It meant his privacy would be further eroded. But then he thought about how many people in his town were struggling with money, not because they were lazy or stupid, but because no one had ever taught them how to think about it differently. And he thought about how much he'd given away in direct financial aid, and how that was helping specific individuals. But teaching might help many more people over time by changing how they understood and used money. "I'll think about it," Martin said. "That's all I ask," Richard replied. Martin did think about it for weeks, and eventually he called Richard back and said yes, he'd be willing to speak to a class. Just once, to see how it went. No promises beyond that. The class met on Tuesday evenings at the community college. About 30 people showed up the first night Martin was scheduled to speak. They were a mix of ages, backgrounds, economic situations, young people drowning in student debt, middle-aged people who'd mismanaged their money for decades and were trying to fix it, older people on fixed incomes trying to make it stretch, single parents, couples, people who worked multiple jobs and still couldn't get ahead, people who made decent money but spent it all. the full spectrum of financial struggle in a small American town. Martin stood in front of them, uncomfortable in the spotlight, and realized he had no idea how to begin. Richard introduced him as someone who'd managed his money exceptionally well over a long career and retirement, which was true, but also deeply incomplete. Martin cleared his throat and started talking. "I'm not an expert," he said. "I don't have a degree in finance. I never worked on Wall Street. I'm just someone who figured out, mostly by accident and through a lot of mistakes, how to live within my means and save consistently over a very long time. And I'm here because someone thought that experience might be useful to share with you." He told them about working at the factory, about packing his lunch for 37 years, about the envelope system, about living below his means, not as a temporary sacrifice, but as a permanent lifestyle. About how the money he saved had given him freedom and security, and eventually the ability to help others. What he didn't tell them was exactly how much wealth he'd accumulated. He didn't mention the $1 million. He didn't talk about the hundreds of thousands he'd given away. He kept those numbers private because they weren't the point. The point was the principles, the habits, the mental frameworks that had made it all possible. When he finished his prepared remarks, he opened it up for questions. A young woman in her 20s raised her hand immediately. "I appreciate what you're saying, but your generation had it easier. You could buy a house on a factory salary. You had pensions. We don't have any of that. How are we supposed to save when everything costs too much, and we barely make enough to survive?" Martin nodded. "You're right. Your generation faces challenges mine didn't. Housing costs relative to income have exploded. Student debt didn't really exist when I was young. Pensions are mostly gone. I don't want to minimize any of that. But I also want to challenge you on something. Is it really true that you barely make enough to survive? Or is it that your definition of survival includes things that are actually optional?" The young woman bristled. "I'm not buying luxuries. I'm barely getting by." "Okay," Martin said gently. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just asking you to look carefully at the difference between what you need and what you want, because that's where the space is. That's where the savings come from, not from depriving yourself of actual needs, but from questioning whether all your wants are really serving you." Another person raised their hand, an older man. "I'm 56. I've got nothing saved. Is it too late for me?" "No," Martin said firmly. "It's not too late. You probably can't accumulate enough to retire early or live luxuriously, but you can build some security. You can get out of debt. You can create a buffer that makes your life less stressful. Every dollar you save matters, regardless of when you start." More questions followed. They talked for over an hour. Martin answered as honestly as he could, trying to balance realism with hope, trying to acknowledge the very real structural barriers people faced, while also insisting that individual agency mattered, that choices mattered, that even in limited circumstances there was usually some room to maneuver. When the class ended, several people approached him privately to ask for more specific advice. Martin gave them his phone number, told them they could call him. Over the following weeks, he ended up meeting with nearly everyone from that class at least once, going through their individual situations, helping them create budgets and plans. And word spread. More people called. More people came by his house. Martin found himself, quite unintentionally, becoming a kind of community financial counselor. He didn't charge anything, he just helped. And he found that he was good at it, not because he had any special training, but because he understood money emotionally as well as mathematically, because he'd lived the principles he was teaching, because he had credibility born from decades of actual practice. One evening, after a particularly long session with a couple who'd been fighting about money for years, Derek said to him, "You know what you're doing, right? You're teaching people what you know, which is valuable. But you're also showing them that it's possible. That someone from their own community, someone they can actually talk to, has figured this out. That's powerful. Martin thought about that. I'm just doing what I can. No, Derek said. You're doing more than that. You're changing the culture. One person at a time, maybe, but still, that's real change. If you've made it this far in this story, thank you. Seriously. I know it's long, I know it takes time, but I hope it's worth it. And if you think someone else would benefit from hearing this, share the video, send it to a friend, post it where people might see it. These stories need to travel. And please, subscribe if you haven't already. There are more stories like this one, and I want you to be there for them. Martin turned 78. His wealth was down to about $150,000. He'd given away the rest. He'd helped more people than he could count. His life looked, from the outside, almost exactly the same as it had 5 years earlier. Same small house, same simple routines. New bicycle, but otherwise identical. But internally, everything had changed. He felt lighter, more connected, less alone. The fortress of accumulated wealth had been dismantled, and what remained was enough for his needs, enough for his security, enough for his peace of mind, and the walls that had once kept everyone out were gone. Then one Tuesday morning, Martin woke up and something was wrong. He couldn't move his left arm properly. His face felt strange, numb on one side. He tried to stand and couldn't keep his balance. He managed to reach his phone and call 911, barely able to speak clearly enough for them to understand. He'd had a stroke. The ambulance came. They took him to the hospital. Tests revealed it was a moderate stroke, not catastrophic, but serious. He'd need rehabilitation. He might recover most function, or he might not. It depended on many factors, most of them outside anyone's control. He was 78 years old. This was the beginning of the end, however long that end might take. Word spread through the community quickly. Martin Webb, the guy who swept the parking lot, who rode a bike everywhere, who'd helped so many people, was in the hospital. People visited, so many people that the hospital staff was overwhelmed. Derek came every day. Diane came several times. Sarah, the nursing student he'd helped years earlier, who was now a working nurse, came and actually provided some of his care. People he didn't even recognize came to say they'd heard he was sick and they were praying for him, and people started talking, really talking, comparing notes, putting pieces together. Derek, after much internal debate, decided it was time to tell the truth. Martin had given him permission, sort of. "If something happens to me," Martin had once said, "you can tell people whatever you think is right to tell them." So Derek told them about Martin's wealth, about the $1 million he'd accumulated and then systematically given away, about how almost every anonymous gift in the past few years had come from him, about how the humble, poor-looking old man had actually been the wealthy benefactor everyone had speculated about. The reaction was mixed. Some people were amazed, grateful, overwhelmed by the revelation. Others felt betrayed, angry that he'd hidden it, that he'd let them pity him when he was secretly rich. Some felt embarrassed that they'd treated him as lesser, as someone to be pitied or dismissed. Some felt manipulated, like they'd been part of an experiment they hadn't consented to. But most just felt awed. This man, who could have lived anywhere, done anything, enjoyed his wealth in 1,000 visible ways, had chosen to live simply among them and use his resources to quietly improve their lives. He'd asked for nothing in return. No gratitude, no recognition, no status. He just helped because he could and because it mattered. The local newspaper ran a story. Local man's secret philanthropy revealed after health crisis. It was picked up by regional media, then national. Martin Webb became briefly a minor sensation. The millionaire who lived like a pauper, the secret benefactor. The man who proved that wealth and humility could coexist. Journalists wanted to interview him, but he was still recovering, still struggling with speech therapy and physical therapy. unable to engage with the media circus that had erupted around his story. Richard Donovan, the lawyer, visited him in the hospital. "Mr. Webb, I want to apologize. I pushed you to structure your giving through proper legal channels, and you resisted. I thought you were just being stubborn. But now I understand. The way you did it, directly and personally, the impact was so much deeper than any foundation could have achieved. You were right, and I was wrong." Martin, speech still slurred, managed to say, "Both right. Different approaches." Richard nodded. "Yes, but yours was more human. That's what I didn't understand. Money isn't just math. It's relationship. You kept the relationship in it. That's rare." Martin spent 2 months in rehabilitation. He recovered most of his speech and most of his mobility, though he walked with a cane now and tired easily. He couldn't ride a bicycle anymore. He couldn't sweep parking lots. His body had betrayed him in ways both predictable and devastating. He was old, suddenly and undeniably, in a way he hadn't been before the stroke. When he finally went home, there was a surprise waiting. The community had pooled resources and repaired his house. The roof had been fixed, the gutters straightened, the cracked window replaced, the faded yellow paint refreshed. His small garden had been tended. Inside, people had cleaned everything, organized everything, left his refrigerator stocked and his pantry full. They'd done for him what he'd been doing for them, helping quietly, asking nothing, just making things better because they could. Martin walked through his house, leaning on his cane, and cried. Not sad tears, though there was some sadness in them, mostly grateful tears, overwhelmed tears, the tears of someone who'd spent decades being strong and self-sufficient and independent, and who'd now discovered that being helped felt just as good as helping, that receiving was its own kind of grace. Derek was there, of course. "We wanted you to come home to something good," he said simply. "Thank you," Martin managed. "No," Derek said, "thank you for everything, for changing my life, for changing so many lives, for showing us all what actually matters." Martin looked around his small, now-repaired house, at the books on their shelf, at the table where he'd divided so many dollar bills into so many envelopes, at the space where he'd lived so deliberately for so long, and he felt something that might have been peace or satisfaction, or maybe just acceptance. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd lived according to his values. He'd proven, at least to himself, that wealth didn't require display, that giving didn't require recognition, that a meaningful life could be constructed from simple materials if you were intentional about it. "Can I ask you something?" Derek said. "Yes." "Do you regret any of it? The way you lived, the money you gave away, the privacy you maintained? If you could do it over, would you do it differently?" Martin was quiet for a long time, considering. Then he said slowly but clearly, "No, I wouldn't change anything. Well, maybe I'd have given away the money faster, but no, I don't regret it. I lived free. That's what the money bought me. Not things, but freedom. Freedom to say no to what didn't matter. Freedom to say yes to what did. Freedom to help without conditions. That's wealth. The money was just the tool. Freedom was the result." Derek thought about that. Most people don't understand that. "No," Martin agreed. "Most people think wealth is about having more, but it's really about needing less. Once you need less, you have more time, more choice, more peace. That's the equation everyone gets backward." The story of Martin Webb spread wider. Articles were written. He was invited to speak at conferences, though he declined due to his health. A foundation was established in his name to continue the kind of direct, personal financial assistance he'd pioneered. Young people discovered his story online and started discussing it, debating whether his approach was replicable in modern economic conditions, whether his frugality was admirable or sad, whether his giving was generous or patronizing. Martin mostly ignored all of this. He couldn't control his narrative once it entered the public sphere, and he didn't try. He just focused on his recovery, on regaining strength, on the small pleasures of his daily routine. Reading in the morning, though not as early as 5:15 anymore. Tea instead of coffee because the coffee made his hands shake. Short walks around his neighborhood with his cane. Visits from friends, which he had now more than he'd ever had in his life. Diane came by once a week with groceries, refusing to let him pay. "You fed half this town, literally or metaphorically," she said. "Let us feed you now." Sarah, the nurse, stopped by to check his blood pressure and make sure he was taking his medications properly. "I wouldn't have finished school without you," she told him. "I'd probably still be working 2 jobs and failing my classes. You changed my entire life. This is the least I can do." The young woman from the financial literacy class, the one who'd challenged him about generational differences, came by to tell him she'd paid off her student loans 6 months early by following the advice he'd given. "You were right," she said. "I was spending money on things I didn't need and calling them necessities. Once I actually looked at where my money was going, I found so much waste. I'm saving now. It feels good." One by one, people came to thank him, to tell him how he'd affected their lives, to offer help now that he needed it. And Martin received these visits with grace, though they exhausted him. He'd spent so long being the strong one, the helper, the person who needed nothing from anyone, learning to be vulnerable, to accept assistance, to let people care for him. That was harder than anything he'd done with money. But he was learning. He was learning that interdependence wasn't weakness. That community wasn't just something you contributed to, but something that held you when you faltered. That the walls he'd built to protect himself, the fortress of self-sufficiency, had also isolated him in ways he hadn't fully recognized until they came down. Giving away his money had torn down those walls, and now people could reach him, could touch his life, could give back. And that was good. That was right. But he was also learning that life was finite in ways he'd intellectually understood but never really felt. His body was breaking down. He got winded going upstairs. His memory was less sharp. He forgot names sometimes, forgot where he'd put things. The stroke had accelerated the aging process, or maybe just made it impossible to ignore. He was mortal. He was declining. He would die. Probably soon. Probably within a few years. And he needed to make peace with that. One quiet evening, alone in his house, Martin took out his old notebook, the one where he'd tracked jobs and income for decades. He flipped through the pages, looking at entries from years and years ago. Parking lot, $40, lawn mowing, $25, snow shoveling, $30, an entire life recorded in small numbers. He totaled them up out of curiosity. Over 14 years of odd jobs after the factory closed, he'd earned about $67,000. All of it saved, all of it eventually given away. He thought about what that money had bought, not in terms of what he'd purchased with it, but in terms of what it had enabled: structure, purpose, connection to his community, the ability to help when help was needed. It had bought meaning. That was the currency he'd actually been dealing in all along. Money was just the medium. Meaning was the goal. And he'd succeeded. His life had been meaningful. He'd contributed more than he'd consumed. He'd left things better than he'd found them. He hadn't been perfect. He'd been isolated and perhaps overly private for too long. He'd maybe been too extreme in his frugality. He could have been more social, more open, more vulnerable earlier. But on balance, he'd done well. He'd lived intentionally, and that counted for something. He closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf. Then he made himself a cup of tea and sat in his chair by the window, looking out at the street as evening fell, and he felt something approaching contentment. Not happiness exactly. His body hurt too much for that, and he missed his old strength too much for that. But contentment, The sense that his life, viewed as a whole, made sense, that it had shape and meaning and coherence, that it was, in its strange way, a success. The months passed. Martin's health stabilized at a new, lower baseline. He could function, but he couldn't work. He could walk, but not far. He could think, but not as quickly or clearly as before. He was diminished, but still himself. Still Martin Webb, still living in his small house, still reading philosophy in the mornings, still dividing what little income he had into envelopes, even though he didn't need to anymore, just because the ritual soothed him. Derek brought him news from the community. The financial literacy program was expanding. More people were attending classes. More people were getting out of debt, building savings, thinking differently about money. The changes Martin had helped start were continuing, growing, becoming self-sustaining. Culture was shifting, slowly but noticeably. "You started something," Derek told him. "It's bigger than you now. It's going to keep going after you're gone." Martin nodded. "Good. That's what should happen. Ideas should outlive their originators. But people won't forget you," Derek added. "Your name is going to mean something here for a long time." Martin shrugged, a small gesture that hurt his shoulder. "Names fade. The impact is what matters. If people in this town are better off in 10 years, in 20 years, because of things that got started now, that's enough. They don't need to remember my name to benefit from what happened." And then, one Tuesday morning, it would be a Tuesday, of course, Martin didn't wake up. He'd gone to sleep the night before after his tea and his reading and his quiet contemplation, and sometime in the night his heart had simply stopped. Peacefully, the doctor said later. No pain, no struggle. Just a transition from sleep to something else. He was 79 years old. The funeral was enormous. Hundreds of people came. The church couldn't hold everyone. They had to set up speakers outside for the overflow. People who'd known him, people he'd helped, people who'd only heard about him but felt connected to his story. They came from all over the region. News crews showed up, wanting to cover the final chapter of the millionaire who'd lived like a pauper. Derek gave the eulogy. He talked about Martin's wisdom, his kindness, his radical approach to money and life. He talked about how Martin had proven that wealth wasn't about accumulation, but about use, not about display, but about impact, not about status, but about freedom. He talked about how Martin had given away a fortune while living simply, how he'd helped hundreds of people without asking for recognition, how he'd changed an entire community by simply living according to his values. "Martin Webb was the richest person I ever knew," Derek said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not because of what he had in the bank, though he had plenty, but because of what he had in his life: freedom, purpose, clarity, generosity. Those are the real currencies of a wealthy life, and Martin was a millionaire in all of them." People cried. People nodded. People looked at each other and thought about their own lives, their own relationships with money, their own choices and priorities. Martin's story, in death as in life, was making people question assumptions, reconsider values, think more deeply about what truly mattered. The will was simple. Martin had left his house to Derek with instructions to sell it and use the proceeds to continue the work of helping people in the community with financial education and direct assistance. He'd left the remainder of his money, about $90,000 after final medical expenses, to establish a permanent fund for emergency financial help for families in crisis. No bureaucracy, no applications, just a simple system where people in genuine need could receive help quickly and without judgment. "He thought of everything," Richard Donovan said, reviewing the will with Derek. "Even his death was organized to maximize impact. That's extraordinary." Derek smiled through tears. "That was Martin. Everything intentional, everything purposeful, right up to the end." The house sold quickly to a young couple buying their first home, a couple who'd attended the financial literacy classes and saved carefully for a down payment, who were doing exactly what Martin would have wanted them to do. Derek handed them the keys and thought about how Martin had bought this house 50 years ago for a fraction of what it was now worth, how he'd maintained it carefully, how he'd lived in it simply, and how even in selling it, it was serving Martin's values by going to people who understood what home ownership meant, who wouldn't take it for granted, who'd worked hard to earn it. The fund started operation immediately. The first person it helped was a single father whose car had broken down and who was going to lose his job if he couldn't get to work. $500 for repairs. Simple, direct, life-changing for that moment. Exactly what Martin had done for years, now systematized so it could continue. The second person helped was an elderly woman facing eviction because she'd fallen behind on rent after an unexpected medical bill. 2 months' rent, $1,700. Crisis averted. Dignity preserved. The third was a young person who'd aged out of foster care and needed help with first and last month's rent for an apartment. $2,200, a stable starting point for an uncertain future. On and on it went. Martin's money, which he'd earned by working and saved by not spending and invested by being patient, continued to circulate through the community, touching lives, solving problems, creating breathing room for people in crisis. His wealth, which he'd accumulated over decades and given away in years, was now perpetually regenerating in the form of human flourishing. And people talked about him. Not as a saint. Martin would have hated that. Not as a perfect man. He wasn't. But as someone who'd figured out something essential about life and money and happiness, and who'd lived that understanding so completely that it couldn't be ignored or dismissed. His story became a kind of parable, told at kitchen tables and in coffee shops and at financial literacy classes. "Did you hear about Martin Webb?" people would ask. "The millionaire who lived like he was poor?" No, the man who understood that wealth isn't about having more, it's about needing less. The guy who gave away everything? No, the guy who kept what mattered and shared the rest. Different tellings, different emphases, but the core remained consistent. Martin had lived a different way. He'd rejected the normal scripts about money and success and status. He'd created his own path, and it had worked. He died with enough, having given away more than most people accumulate, having helped more people than most people meet, having proved that a meaningful life doesn't require excess, that wealth can be quiet, that generosity doesn't need publicity, that you can be rich and humble at the same time. So here's what I want you to take from this story as we close. Not that you should live exactly like Martin. Your context is different, your challenges are different, your values might be different, but maybe consider the underlying principle that money is a tool, not a master, that enough is enough, that visible wealth and actual wealth aren't the same thing, that the richest life isn't the one with the most possessions, but the one with the most freedom, the most purpose, the most alignment between values and actions. Martin Webb looked poor to everyone who saw him, right up until the end. But he was wealthy in ways most people never achieve. He had financial security, yes, but more importantly, he had autonomy. He had meaning. He had the satisfaction of helping others. He had simplicity, which brought peace. He had freedom from the expectations and judgments of a culture that measures worth by visible consumption. He had lived exactly the life he wanted to live, according to exactly the values he believed in, without compromise or apology. Everyone thought he was poor. They were wrong. He was rich beyond measure. He just measured richness differently than most people do. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not how to make money or save money or even give away money, but how to measure what matters, how to define wealth in ways that actually align with human flourishing instead of just economic activity. How to Live Free. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to Martin's story, for thinking about these questions. I hope it sparked something in you. I hope it made you reconsider some assumptions. I hope it made you think about your own relationship with money and success and meaning. If it did, please share this video. Please leave a comment about what it made you feel or think. Please subscribe so you're here for the next story. These conversations matter. These stories matter. You matter. And how we think about wealth and poverty and what constitutes a rich life matters more than we usually acknowledge. Martin Webb was poor only in the eyes of those who couldn't see past surfaces. In truth, he was one of the wealthiest men who ever lived, not despite his simple life, but because of it. He proved that wealth is freedom, that freedom is choice, that choice is power, and that power used wisely can change the world, one person, one envelope, one act of quiet generosity at a time. Everyone thought he was poor. They were wrong, and that wrongness, that gap between appearance and reality, that's where the truth lives, that's where real wealth hides. That's where Martin Webb spent his entire life, invisible to those who only see what they expect to see, but blazingly obvious to anyone who takes the time to actually look. The question is, are you looking? Are you seeing? Are you learning? Because the story isn't over. It continues in every choice you make about money, about simplicity, about what truly matters. Martin's story is finished. Yours is still being written. Make it count.